Well, good evening and welcome to Centerpoint on this Christmas weekend. I'm Rob Astorino. We hope you're enjoying this Christmas season with family and friends, and in the midst of all this hustle and bustle and getting those presents under the tree, we also hope that you take at least a moment to understand the reason for the season. And in a world where saying Merry Christmas is getting controversial, believe it or not, we want to dig into the history of Christmas and how we celebrate Christmas here in America. We have a special guest for the big day, the president of Wall Builders, Tim Barton, a pro-family group that helps keep the focus on America's great history, our heroes, and our constitutional, moral, and religious history. And Tim is now a regular on Centerpoint, and our viewers really enjoy your participation. So welcome back to Centerpoint.
Rob, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Oh, it's great. You know, look, a lot of people right now are probably getting ready to go shopping, getting back from shopping, getting ready for Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. It's a crazy time. But a lot of people don't realize anything about Christmas other than maybe Jesus and Santa Claus.
Sure.
Right? So take me through let's start with the history of Christmas.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't always recognized.
Right. So, and especially in America, as you even mentioned that. So Christmas is, as you mentioned, if we only know Jesus and Santa Claus, well, those are probably two really good ones to know, especially if you know the real story of Santa Claus and the real story of Jesus. With that being said, though, you're right that so many of us, even in America, we don't know much of the history, even of Christmas in our own nation. And I say that specifically because when you look back at Christmases in America, there were times when in America, we didn't really celebrate Christmas, especially the way we do now, where we could argue now there's been a lot of commercialization of Christmas, that many people have forgotten the true reason for the season. We don't really honor Jesus maybe the way he should be honored. But if you back up in early America, it's very interesting that as the early colonies were being formed, they were largely formed for religious reasons. The majority of the early immigrants to America, they were religiously motivated individuals coming to find religious freedom. And where they had left in Europe had gone through a commercialization of Christmas by and large as well. Actually,
it was banned in certain countries at times. Great Britain banned Christmas celebrations at one point.
Well, and you're right. And it actually got banned in America too. And part of the reason was they recognized that what's happening is really trivializing what should be a sacred, holy time where we are really remembering with reverence the birth of a Savior and who Jesus was. And when you trivialize it and you make everything else more important than Jesus, it said, we're not going to do that. And so for a lot of the religious colonies, especially in America, but you're right, even at times in Europe, they would have different laws or restrictions in place. And really this, to me, it leads to some of the really fun stories of America, because when America first becomes a nation in 1776, the first Christmas of December of 1776, this is the middle of the Revolution. And for people who maybe can track and catch up with us as the history of the Revolution unfolds, with the Declaration being presented to the public July 4th, 1776, as you go forward, America is heavily engaged against the British in this American Revolution, and we pretty much have lost every battle along the way. George Washington is the commander of the military. The military enlistments were between 6 months and a year, depending on if you were in a local militia or the Continental Army. But all of the enlistments, whether it was 6 months or a year, they were up December is when they finished. So January 1st, you had to have people re-enlist. And Washington recognized, we've had no victories and nobody wants to re-enlist with the losers. So Washington is trying to figure out, how can we guarantee a victory to maybe incentivize men they want to re-enlist, give them hope. And Washington, realizing it's Christmas time, he also recognizes that for the British, they had some alliances, and actually the Germans had units that were working specifically with the British, and they almost like mercenaries, but the Hessians were working with the British. And in Germany, this is one of the places where Christmas maybe was being trivialized in some ways, because one of the things Washington knew about the Germans is at Christmas time, these guys are going to drink real heavy.
Ein Bier, please.
Right? These guys probably are not going to be the most suitable in battle if it comes after Christmas. So Washington's idea is there's a fort up in Trenton where the Hessians, there's 1,000 Hessians at this fort. Let's go Christmas night, when we know they're going to be getting plastered, they're drinking. Christmas night, let's go. And we can surround the fort. We'll be there in time the next morning, that when they wake up, right, maybe with a little bit of hangover, they're going to see the American forces. This was their idea. Now, a couple complicating factors with this is also December up in the New York, New Jersey area, which
I can tell you it's cold.
Right, as a Southern guy, right, a Texan, we don't really comprehend this. I know for you guys, there's like this white stuff that falls on the ground. We're not really familiar with that here. But Washington, the plan was they're going to cross the Delaware with 5,400 troops. And that's a lot of troops to get across with miserable conditions. And as they begin crossing the Delaware that evening, they have a lot of difficulty getting across because there was huge chunks of ice floating down, and so it was keeping some of their boats from getting in. And they're trying to take also their cannons, their horses across. They're trying to get everybody across. The thought was with 5,400 men against 1,000 men, we're going to guarantee a victory, and it's going to be so overwhelming, right? The men will feel encouraged. This was an easy victory, guys. We can win. Let's keep going. The problem is they're not able to get their men across that night. As the night goes on, for hours, they're trying to get across. For 4 hours, they're trying to cross, and they thought they might be across maybe by midnight. They don't get across. At 4 a.m., Washington says, we're going to have to go with who we have. It was 2,400 men that got across. So they're 3,000 down in the number of what they were hoping to have. Their numbers are less than half. He says, we're going to have to go because we still have a 12-mile march. We have to get there, right? Because, again, we want them to have a hangover, right? We want them to not really be with it when we arrive in the morning. So they begin a 12-mile march with 2,400 men. Also,
did they bring eggnog with them just in case? Or no?
You know, they were not prepared on any level. For the American military, they were not prepared for winter. And it's very well documented that many of them didn't have winter coats. Some of them didn't even have shoes on their feet. Some of the records of them walking, leaving bloody footprints in the snow because they're walking barefoot in the snow. This is that kind of march they're making. Conditions only get worse for them as they go because a massive blizzard rolls in. And I can only imagine, right? If I'm one of the American troops, one of the soldiers, and I feel like I'm trying to do a God-honoring thing because I'm fighting for freedom and liberty and religious liberty and right, this notion of the God-given rights that we have. And on the march, now you have a blizzard. I mean, who else are you talking to? You're like, God, what are you doing right now, right? We're trying to do the right thing. Well, the blizzard was so significant, 2 men actually died during the march. And probably the reality is that they were so cold, they sat down to rest for a minute. And when you sit down in a blizzard, you don't have the clothing you need, right? That's probably what happened to them. Well, what is one of the miraculous things about this blizzard, because it took them so long to get across, there was no way they were going to arrive in time the next morning before sun came up, which was the initial idea. But the blizzard was so bad that the German officer said, nobody's crazy to be out in this weather. So he calls the guard back inside the fort so they can stay warm by the fire. So there's literally nobody keeping lookout on the fort. So Washington gets there later in the morning. He's set up by 8 a.m. They make the announcement that they're surrounded. We want you to surrender. Well, the battle opens up. It ensues for about 45 minutes. And when you have somebody in an entrenched position and the battle lasts only 45 minutes, that's pretty impressive. The battle's over so quickly. At the end of that battle, 20 Hessians had died, 100 were wounded, but all 1,000 of the Hessians who were there surrendered. On the American side, there were only 3 that were wounded during the entire battle. So it was a major victory, and of course it does boost morale. But what's also interesting about this, and as we study history, we always look for the moments where it's evident that God showed up in some significant way, right? Even the idea that there's a blizzard that causes the Hessian guards to go inside, God is doing something on your behalf in this moment. Well, along the lines when they're marching toward Trenton, toward the fort, there is a doctor. They're walking by his house. His dog starts barking, and the doctor comes to the door to see what's going on. He has his musket in his hands, and he looks out and sees all these American troops. So he calls out, says, hey, what are y'all doing? Where are y'all going? And they told him, we're marching on Trenton. We're going to try to go capture and take Trenton. He said, I'm a doctor. You might need help. Let me come with you in case you need help. So you have a doctor literally on the scene. There was 3 Americans that were wounded. Well, there's one specific American. This doctor literally saved this guy's life because he was shot in the chest right above the heart. The records identify that it nicked an artery. So this doctor essentially sticks his finger in, plugs the hole, is able to cauterize it and save this guy's life. Well, the guy whose life he saved was a man named James Monroe. He went on to be the 5th president of the United States, but he was there that night. And what's so remarkable is we look back, even over maybe one of the first Christmases in America, it's so evident that God showed up on so many occasions. And there's a lot of Christmases we can kind of see that story along the way. And as we're mentioning, even George Washington, I think he's one of the most remarkable Americans that's ever lived. We have a lot of things in our collection from George Washington. This is an original letter from George Washington. It's got his signature down here on the bottom.
Wow.
We also have a pretty interesting piece of jewelry. This is a ring, but this specific ring has a lock of hair in it. This lock of hair is George Washington's. When he died, Martha cut off several locks of hair and gave it to people that were important to the family. This specific lock went to Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton had a wife and a daughter, and one of them put it in this ring. It was known as a mourning ring. And it was called a mourning ring because it would have the hair of the individual that they were mourning, and you would wear this kind of in their honor. But this is literally a lock of George Washington's hair. And so for us, it's fun collecting things from these individuals, pieces of history that are kind of significant along the way, but more so than just a fun letter or a ring, looking back and seeing the time that God showed up in miraculous ways to, in this case, help certainly the cause of liberty in America, freedom, God-given rights. And the fact it happened on Christmas time is just a really fun bonus. As we look at Christmas, there's a lot of fun Christmases in America, and this is just one of them.
So 'twas the night before Christmas, and I still have to get my wife a gift. Is that possible?
No souvenirs today, right?
Okay. We have a lot more with Tim to talk about, especially as we get further into American history and more contemporary. And so that means you have to stay right here because we have so much more goodies to come. Welcome back to Centerpoint. I'm Rob Astorino with Tim Barton, and we're talking about the history of Christmas here in America. But just historically, let's go back through some timelines. It wasn't until Roman Emperor Constantine celebrated the first Christmas on earth back in the 300s. And about the same time, Pope Julius I designated December 25th to be Christmas, even though it's not in the Bible, the birth of Jesus. Right. And Christmas was established as a federal holiday here in the United States in 1870 under President Ulysses S. Grant. But it's not like we didn't celebrate in some way. We always did. And the one thing that you and I have been talking about is the providential aspect of this, where God was always part of this, whether we celebrated it or not.
Well, yeah, and the idea, I think it was John Quincy Adams who said that the two most significant holidays in America are the 4th of July and Christmas, because we celebrate, and this is literally what he explained. He said we celebrate the freedom that Christ gave to us when we look at Christmas, and we celebrate the freedom that God gave to us when we look at the 4th of July.
Well, great point.
They're both freedoms God gave, but absolutely, in early America, God was such a central part of who we were and what we did. In fact, even when you talk about when America first became a federal holiday under Ulysses S. Grant, this is somebody that a lot of people don't recognize. I mean, he was very rough around the edges, but they don't recognize that he was very pro-God and pro-faith. And maybe not as much. You have Garfield coming in after him, and Garfield, who was also in the Union Army Civil War. He actually had been part of the Second Great Awakening. He was a pastor in the Second Great Awakening before his military or before his congressional involvement. Nonetheless, faith was always a central theme in America, and people who don't see the faith connection, it's because they really don't know the story as well as they think they do. And unfortunately, in the modern narrative, we hear details of the story. And when I was growing up, one of my favorite individuals to listen to was Paul Harvey.
Oh, good day.
Right? And Paul, he was so great because he would give you a teaser of a story, and then he would come back, and now the rest of the story. Right. And for so many Americans, we just don't know the rest of the story. And if we begin to learn more of the story, we would recognize how God used people in significant ways, how God showed up in significant ways. And I think we would appreciate the American story a lot more if we actually knew the story, because we would see God's hand and God's connection in it. Doesn't mean that people didn't make major mistakes or that America hasn't made mistakes and, definitely done some sinful, wicked, evil things along the way. But the reality is that just like the nation of Israel, God was a part of that story. God didn't abandon them, even when they at times rejected God's principles. And certainly as we go through even the story of Christmas, as we're celebrating this weekend Christmas, there's two of my favorite Christmas stories in America. One is with George Washington, who I think is one of the greatest American heroes there was. But then there's another guy who was very rough around the edges, General Patton. And General Patton was a guy that arguably without George Washington, we don't win the American Revolution. Yeah, America doesn't really become America without George Washington. Well, I think it's interesting. You can make a pretty compelling argument that had it not been for General George Patton, World War II could have gone very, very differently. Because Patton virtually didn't lose any battle he was in. And he was a major leader, a major player in what's happening in World War II. Had it not been for his poor treatment of a couple soldiers along the way, probably he would have been a 4-star general at the end of World War II. And part of that, too, Patton, in the dynamic, he was a guy who loved God, had a really good heart. He was just, as mentioned, rough around the edges. And this encounter with a soldier, there was a soldier, General Patton would go to medical tent where there were guys who had been wounded. And he wanted to check on them, maybe encourage them, boost their morale. And he saw a guy laying on a cot who had no physical injuries. And there's guys in the room who are missing an arm or a leg, right, who have bullet holes all on their body. And he said, you are dishonoring those guys by laying in here when you have no physical injury. And at this point, people just weren't really as aware about the mental and emotional trauma, right? The post-traumatic stress kind of scenario. At the end of World War II, they kind of knew the idea of being shell-shocked, but it was still a new thought in a lot of regards. And so he's thinking, right, you need to be mentally tough. And right now you're physically fine. So he actually slaps the soldier. And it's also worth noting at the time, they had what was called shock therapy, where they actually could shock people, try to get them out of an emotional state that maybe they didn't think was helpful. And so, maybe it's shock therapy as he slaps this guy a little bit, but because of his treatment of that soldier, and there was one or two accounts like this, he had to apologize. And this is where arguably he was not promoted. He was overlooked because of some of this mistreatment. However, this guy didn't lose any battle. And one of the more remarkable battles that I think for this conversation is worth pointing to is the Battle of the Bulge. And at this point, this is after D-Day. The Germans are over in Europe. The Allied forces are pushing the Germans back into Germany. And so you have a line that you have the First Army in the north, the Third Army in the south, and they're just marching from the west to the east, pushing all the Nazis back into Germany. And as they're going, General Patton has what's believed to be really kind of like the best intelligence in all of the military. Eisenhower and Patton may be comparable on their level of intelligence, but Patton really believed you have to have the best intelligence. And Patton's men began reporting that there were some German units, really skilled German units, who began pulling back from the line. And Patton is talking with officers, and they realize the only reason they'd be pulling back is if they can regroup, and they're going to go attack somewhere else. And he realizes they're going to go attack the First Army in the north, and General Patton with the Third Army has 250,000 men. And in order to maybe redirect to go help the First Army, with 250,000 men, you have to figure out where are we going to put the meals for them along the way, right? We have to have feeding stations along the way. Or if you're going to move the tanks and the vehicles, you have to have fueling stations along the way. So Patton sends orders. He says, I want you to start putting fueling stations going north so that when we have to turn and help, we are ready to turn and help. Well, sure enough, the German military did what was known as blitzkrieg, and they assembled a massive amount of men, tanks, ground personnel, armored vehicles, and they attack what was thought to be a place in the First Army. The Germans aren't going to attack high up in the mountains, right? This is not practical. Why would they do this? Well, the Germans knew the Americans aren't really ready for this one. They don't think we'd go there, so they attack in a place that the Americans weren't really fortified. The Germans get through. They go about 60 to 80 miles past the American line. They then turn around, and so they have the First Army surrounded. And as the First Army surrounded, Eisenhower gets word. He calls his generals in. Patton is there. And Eisenhower tells George Patton, he says, George, you're going to go north and you're going to help defend the First Army. We're going to go actually, and Patton says, well, let's just go. Let's bottle up the guys on the backside. Let's conquer them, and then we'll reform the line and go. And Eisenhower, it was almost like he thought Patton was going to push back, because Patton was known as kind of telling you what he thought, whether that was a good or bad decision. And he told General Eisenhower, he said, yes, sir, it's what we're going to do. And people are like, I can't believe he just agreed to that. This is crazy. It's because he already knew that's what was going to have to happen. He was already prepared for it. So he was able, what should have taken maybe a couple weeks to get all of his Third Army up to protect the First Army, help the First Army. They're able to do it in a matter of days. While they're going up, for the last 3 months, the Americans have, and really Allied forces, they've had really, really bad weather. And because they're having such bad weather, they're not able to get their planes up off the ground. At this point, the German military has lost about 90% of their air force. So the American has great air superiority. The Allied forces, they're definitely better in the air, but the Germans still have the best ground game with their tanks. Their tanks were far better than the Sherman tank the Americans had, but it didn't matter because as long as we could get our planes up, we would bomb their tanks, and then our tanks against their infantry, that's no problem. But with 3 months of bad weather, they're not able to get their planes off the ground. So as they're marching north, this is when General Patton maybe has a change of strategy to some extent about maybe the best solution going forward.
It's amazing the history of the world and certainly the war and how God played a role in it. And when we come back quickly, we'll talk about the prayers that these generals, these strong generals, would utilize with their men, which would never happen today, but it did back then, and some of the more modern traditions of Christmas. So stick around on Centerpoint. It's almost Christmas time, and we've been having a great conversation on the history of Christmas in America and throughout the world. So we were talking about military battles.
Yes.
And these big, generals, tough guys. But religion and God was very much a part of their life.
Big time. So we were talking about General Patton leading up to the Battle of Bulge. Really, it was the battle for Bastogne at this point, which was a center point, a lot of roadways. And so the Americans, the Allied forces, needed to be able to hold that, to hold Bastogne. So General Patton is going north. They've had really bad weather, and he needs a break in the weather. One of the things that happens along the way, December 23rd, he stops at a chapel, and one of the things, this is actually a magazine that tells the story. His officers group, his personnel, they were with them, and so there's several accounts from this. But one of the things he would do frequently was go to chapels. He would take off, his men reported that he would take off his helmet. He would go up front where there was often a statue of Jesus, and he would give basically the report to the commanding officer. So he would tell Jesus, here's what's happening, here's what's going on. Well, in this specific event, December 23rd, he goes, and actually they say he even cussed at God a little bit. He said, you need to figure out whose side are you on. I'm not sure what you're doing right now. Are you on Hitler's side or on our side? Because you've given us victory at every moment up until now, but now you're not giving us an assured victory because you're not giving us good weather. Without good weather, we can't get our planes off the ground. He says, if you would just give me 4 days of good weather, with 4 days, I would send you more Germans, more Nazis, and your bookkeeper knew how to handle. If you would, and he goes on through this prayer and finally finishes his thoughts, says amen, turns, puts his helmet on, they leave, all the men leave, but they actually took notes of the prayer because as they're hearing it, they're like, I can't believe he's saying this. So several men took notes, they compiled at the end. General Patton came and read it and said, that is correct, that's what I said. What's interesting is that day, he also met with the media and he showed the media, the news correspondents, he said, I have a prayer card, and this prayer card I'm giving to the 250,000 men in the Third Army. They're going to pray this prayer for good weather. Here's the prayer. It says, Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we've had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among men and nations. Amen. Well, this prayer card gets issued. He has this prayer with God. The next 9 days, they have clear weather. Their planes get off the ground. They bomb the German tanks. They end up winning this battle.
Wow.
And it's another one of those clear moments where God intervened, God involved. And had it not been for God's involvement, right, this story could have gone very differently. But to your point, it's not just also that God got involved. We actually had leaders who believed it was important to call out and ask for God to get involved, knowing and recognizing we needed God's help.
Hard to do it by yourself.
It is.
So one of the most, misconceptions, I guess that's the right word, is Xmas, right?
Yeah.
And it annoys me, but for the wrong reason, because I think people are too lazy to write Christmas.
Correct.
But X is really not a bad thing.
Well, not if you know the origins, right? Because you're right. There's a move to keep Christ in Christmas. And I have been a vocal advocate. Let's keep Christ in Christmas.
I've never written Xmas on a card.
Never. And to your point, I feel like it's lazy.
Yeah.
Now, it's also because I don't do Greek, right? I mean, as a Bible person, Hebrew, Greek, yes, I can go back, use my concordance, I can look it up and read it. But the reality is that the Greek letter X was the symbol for Christ. And so when Xmas first originated, it really was Christmas. But I think there's probably people today that don't know that history, that don't care about it, and maybe you're just too lazy to write Christ. The original thought was not to remove Christ from Christmas. It was just the Greek version of Christmas along the way, although I think we've probably forgotten that today.
Real fast, your favorite Christmas movie?
It's hard to not say It's a Wonderful Life.
It's gotta be, Mary. It's gotta be, right?
It's hard not.
Yes.
I mean, there's White Christmas. There's so many good ones.
Yeah.
But It's a Wonderful Life. It's a go-to.
It's the best. My neighbor has what I think is such a wonderful nativity scene in his front yard. It's the nativity scene with baby Jesus, and there's a cutout of Santa Claus kneeling in homage.
Yes.
That is what Christmas is about.
Absolutely.
In that order.
Yeah.
So, Tim, I thank you. I really do. We learned a lot. We had a lot of fun, and now we know more about Christmas and where it started and how it's evolved in America, including the Christmas tree coming over from traditionally in Germany.
Yeah.
So anyway, I thank you so much for being here, and we'll do it again.
Sounds great.
All right. So that's it for tonight, and we hope you have a wonderful Christmas. We are delighted that you've made Centerpoint a destination this year, and we want to hope that you commit to be with us for next year. And we're going to be committed to more informative, honest news with a Christian worldview in the months and years ahead. For Doug McElway and the entire Centerpoint staff here at TBN, I'm Rob Astorino. Have a great weekend and a blessed Merry Christmas.